to wait too long, and I would like to start by welcoming you very much to this today's lecture, Civic Patrons and Common Benefactors, the Language of Honor in Roman Asia during the Late Republic. First, I would like to inform you that the video and the audio is being recorded and live streamed to YouTube and will be saved and remain available there. Audio and video for the audience is off by default, and can only be turned on by the host. But because we are quite a number of people, we are going to leave it as it is. Can I ask you to, when you have a question, to put your question, to write your question in the Q&A at the bottom. Then after the lecture, I will read out your question and say who you are, who is the person who posed the question, and then Brad will answer. You are also very welcome to introduce yourself via the chat so that we know where everybody who is attending this lecture is coming from, and so that you can introduce yourself to Brad and say, hi, Brad, here's from Melbourne, or from wherever, or you can also introduce yourself to one another. I would now like to introduce the speaker, and today, the speaker today is one of the BIAA postdoctoral fellows of this year's. Dr. Bradley Jordan studied at the University of Western Australia for his BA, and afterwards his MA at the University of Melbourne. He then moved to the UK and did his DPhil at Oxford, which he finalized in 2019 in history, so Roman, Byzantine, and early Ottoman history. Afterwards, he moved to Cologne, University of Köln, Universität zu Köln, where he worked on the relationship between Rome and allied rulers in the Eastern Mediterranean during the late Republic. Unfortunately, that's when COVID hit. So I think that Brad did not enjoy Cologne as one would enjoy it in, let's put it, normal times, but there we are. So he's now with us, working as a postdoctoral fellow at the British Institute at Ankara, and he's finalizing his monograph, which is to be published at Oxford University Press. And his monograph is on Roman administration in the province of Asia during the transition from Republic to Principate. And we today are fortunate enough to hear a little bit of what is going to be in that monograph, I think. So he investigates in this talk how civic decrees, so resolutions taken by the core administrative bodies of Greek-speaking communities, the demos and the boule, operated as part of a dialogue between communities in the province of Asia and the Roman state during the late Republic. It focuses on what role these decrees played in negotiating the relationship with the Roman state and its representative. In addition, he will also concentrate on how the language of these decrees came to define local views of and engagement with Roman Empire in Asia. So without further ado, I would like to pass the word to Brad, and I'm really looking forward to this talk. The word is yours.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Lut, for that introduction. And thank you again, and to the Institute more broadly for hosting me and facilitating this presentation. I'm just going to bring up my PowerPoint. Just want to check that that has appeared. It seems to be okay. So yes, as Lut mentioned, I'm currently pulling together the manuscript for my first monograph, which investigates both how the late Roman Republic established an institutional framework to govern the province of Asia in what is now Western Turkey, and the dialectic between Roman hegemony and local agency in the crucial first century of Roman rule. Yeah, there we go. So today I'm going to focus on the latter part of that topic. Specifically, this paper investigates how civic decrees, that is, decisions enacted by the political institutions of a city-state or a polis, operated as part of a dialogue between communities in the province of Asia and the Roman state during the late Republic and the reign of Augustus. As a sort of necessary and very cursory background, Roman hegemony began after the death of the last monarch of Pergamum, Attalus III, in 133 BCE, and was consolidated after the defeat of a royal pretender, Aristonicus, between 129 and 126 BCE. After approximately 50 years, during which the cities largely remained formally free, the limits of which were inevitably contested, the invasion of the province by Mithridates, the sixth of Pontus, threw the region into turmoil. After the latter's withdrawal in 85 BCE, the Roman commander Sulla stripped most cities of this freedom and subjected them firmly to the authority of the Roman governor, though it is important to note that precise arrangements varied from city to city. Now, given this context, my question today is, what role did these civic decrees play in constructing Roman Empire on the ground in Asia? The majority of the extant material from this period is honorific in nature and was publicly inscribed within the issuing polis. Public recognition of an individual's worth to and within the polis community had significant implications. While the positive judgment of the demos or the boule offered recipients political and social capital, its acceptance and increasingly its permanent inscription reasserted the primacy of these institutions as the gatekeepers of honor. At least initially, most recipients were local citizens, minor benefactors, who remained members of the demos and were contained within it, even if a tension inevitably existed between social competitiveness and the communitarian ethos of a Greek city. But this dialectic also proved a useful mechanism for wrangling with powerful external figures, namely Hellenistic monarchs and Roman officials. John Marr's description of the relationship between Antiochus III, a Seleucid monarch, and the cities of Asia presents a robust paradigm of the former. He persuasively argued that honorific decrees presented by ambassadors operated in dialogue with royal letters awarding benefactions to civic communities. Consequently, these two genres, the honorific decree and the royal letter, formed a discursive space wherein monarchs and communities could negotiate their relative status in a carefully reciprocal manner. In turn, this promoted an ongoing relationship between monarchs as benefactors and communities as honorific agents, which manifested itself as an exchange of concrete privileges in return for the acknowledgement of royal status and the legitimacy of the hierarchy between monarch and civic community. This do or des principle, I give so that you might give, was given further utility through the limited, specific, and neutral vocabulary employed in both forms, which allowed the parties to negotiate in a non-confrontational fashion. Civic decrees could play this role as they seemed to directly articulate the voice of that community, of the issuing community. Though varying in their language and the identity of the initiating body, for example, the boule, the council, or the ecclesia, the demos, the community, or both, surviving decrees of the late Hellenistic and Roman period tend to follow a standard and relatively lengthy format, including a preamble with the date and the responsible magistrates, at least one, but more commonly several motivation clauses giving the reasons behind the decision. And finally, an impersonal edoxen or dedocthi, it is decreed, it is decided, which presented the resolutions themselves. Now, for context, a series of honorific decrees from mid to late 2nd century Praeni and Colophon run to an average of 250 to 300 lines. And there's a representative example there, which if you can make out the writing, there's many hundreds of lines of text from Sestos. Now, though these texts purport to offer a bold statement of the will of the community, As finished products, they allayed any disagreements or debate which had occurred during the process of their formulation. Most often, the text preserved was not the product of negotiation within the assembly, but one which had been referred en bloc by the decree's drafters or a smaller committee. Consequently, we cannot assume that any extant decree represented a universal or enduring decision on the part of the city. Nevertheless, as a final recorded displayed text, as invariably these are inscriptions that we have, the surviving documents carried the authority of civic political institutions and acted as a voice for the whole community. Now, I've argued elsewhere, and elsewhere in the forthcoming monograph, but sadly do not have time to explore in detail here, that when the Roman Republic became hegemon of the cities of Asia after 133 BCE, this system, described by Ma, was fundamentally disrupted. In place of a clear hierarchy with a Hellenistic monarch at its head, the late Roman Republic consisted at its core of a series of institutions with overlapping responsibilities and powers, subject to negotiation and conflict between nearly 100 powerful individuals, senators, while representatives on the ground, magistrates, were changed on a near annual basis. Indeed, we have from this period only one analogous example of an honorific civic decree for a Roman resulting in an epistolary response. And that's a letter by the proconsul Quintus Oppius responding to Aphrodisias in 85, which I'll get to in just a moment. This particular example is particularly problematic, as it is also our only example of the commencement of a relationship of civic patronage, which again, I'll discuss in a moment. Now, generally, Roman documents, even where prompted by local petitions, responded to a different repertoire of concepts than Hellenistic royal letters, leaving aside the honorific aspect central to royal civic exchanges. Instead of overt reciprocity, the Senate and people and their representatives operated largely in terms of fides, in Greek translation pistis, or loyalty, faith. As Angelos Kaniotis, among others, has stressed, this change in the effective basis of diplomacy forced cities to experiment with emotional and political scripts in order to effectively maintain their privileges. In this paper, I asked, despite this change, what role these honorific decrees continue to play in negotiating the relationship between Greek poleis and the representatives of the Roman state in the form of magistrates and their assistants. I examine how poleis engaged with individual Romans honorifically, looking at different strategies employed by cities, and interrogating whether this can be considered an attempt to forge an ongoing connection with the Roman state. While Roman hegemony undermined the existing system of political exchange, that did not discourage cities from choosing to honor individual Romans. While traditional Roman notions of aristocratic honor tended to be more personally and less publicly constructed than in Hellenistic terms, by which I mean honorific monuments at Rome tended to be privately rather than publicly funded, amid the competitive environment of the late Republican political elite, individuals certainly did not shirk the opportunity presented by these civic honorific practices. As political power in the Roman state became increasingly concentrated and the institutions of the Principate coalesced, the civic decree became an integral part of the imperial system. The politics of honor, as the title of one recent volume puts it, were integral to local strategies for co-opting Roman assistance and goodwill across this period. Now, as the starting point for this inquiry, the letter of Quintus Oppius to Aphrodisias in 85 is particularly revealing. The text indicates that the interaction between the city and the Roman proconsul followed the traditional structure of interaction which I've already described between a city and a Hellenistic monarch. And I quote, Quintus Oppius, the proconsul of the Romans, praetor, sends greetings to the magistrates, council, and people of the Ploratians and Aphrodisians. Your ambassadors, fine and good men, met me at Kos, congratulated me, and gave me the decree in which it was reported that you rejoiced at my presence, as I certainly believe, in view of your good intentions towards myself and our, as Rome's, public affairs. For these reasons, I am taking care, both as a magistrate and in a private capacity, to do whatever I can while preserving my good faith, my pistis, my fides, to help you and your public affairs, and always to act to your advantage. So what we see here in this text is ambassadors from Aphrodisias visiting a Roman magistrate and delivering a decree passed, most likely by the civic assembly. The content of the decree is reported as the Aphrodisians rejoicing at Oppius' presence, which we might read here as his survival of the recent invasion of Asia by Mithridates. After outlining his own reasons for believing this expression of joy to be sincere, Oppius responds that he will correspondingly work to the benefit of Aphrodisias, both as a magistrate and out of office as a privatus, neatly highlighting the circumscribed nature of his influence when he laid down his magistracy. While this closely resembles the form of earlier Hellenistic letters and has been taken as paradigmatic, it should be reasserted here that this is our only republican example in Asia of such an exchange. Moreover, the final sentence of this letter invokes a Holy Roman institution, civic patronage. The same ambassadors also asked that it might be possible that you should enjoy my patronage, my patroneia, and I accepted those men on account of my regard for your city, and I undertook to be patron of your people. Now, without diving into unnecessary detail, Roman personal patronage was a relationship between social unequals, patron and client respectively, to protect each other's interests. On the part of the patron, this could, for example, involve financial assistance or representation in judicial cases. Civic patronage was the extension of this phenomenon to cover whole communities and became common in the Greek-speaking East during the 1st century BC. It is grounded in the same concept, and as the use of the transliterated Latin term in Greek, patron, shows, this was foreign to the cities requesting it, as Aphrodisias did here. Now, neither Greeks nor Romans viewed this term as synonymous with existing Greek labels. It represented the deliberate deployment of a Roman concept to honor Roman magistrates. However, this amalgamated civic honorific practice and Roman social institutions in a novel way. Patronage for Roman aristocrats was not in itself an honorific position. Though having numerous significant individuals in one's clientele demonstrated one's worth and influence within the Roman political community, the relationship itself was a formal consensual agreement. And this was equally true of patronage exercised over civic communities. Though alien to the Hellenistic world, civic patronage did share with royal practice the establishment of a personal bond between an individual and the poleis. However, the distinction between the two types of interaction ought to be maintained, I argue. It is not clear that the request for Oppius patronage should imply a subordinate role for the community. The institution appears here and is attested elsewhere as the result of a consensual decision. Oppius' letter also shows unambiguously that honors were not given to the governor in expectation of benefaction during his command. Oppius was already on his way back to Rome at this point. Rather, the opposite was true. Now, other early examples, including well-known decrees from Teos in the mid-2nd century and Colophon in the late 2nd century, also support this, presenting ambassadors as actively negotiating in Rome to engage their patroni. As Oppius carefully highlights, he will act in the interests of Aphrodisias both as a magistrate and in a private capacity. And the document structure outlines the request's centrality of the embassy. Oppius presents patronage as an independent issue from the honorific decree, complete with its own request, motivation, and decision clauses. It's treated as a serious and deliberate political choice exercised by the poleis and to be assessed on its own merits. Now, throughout the late Republic and the early Principate, cities passed honorific decrees and erected public statues for Romans, co-opting the official representative of the hegemonic power into their existing network of honor. However, for the most part, our evidence derives not from full honorific decrees, these 250 to 300 line epics, but from inscribed statue bases, which provide a truncated summary of the interaction between community and individual. The standard formula, of which I present an example here for Lucius Torquatus, the demos honored X son of Y, Lucius Torquatus, son of Lucius, on account of his excellence, his arete, and his goodwill, his eunoia. This elided differences between the actions of individual honorands. Comparatively, surviving monuments for local benefactors more often present the full honorific decree, even where a statue was the result, thereby presenting a full civic-orientated account of an individual's career and encouraging its integration into local history as an exemplum to be followed. Now, Gabriel Freire has argued that the relative dearth of full decrees for Roman benefactors was deliberate, and that the reduced size of the honorific vocabulary employed offered poleis flexibility in dealing with officials. The vague moral qualities, arete, eunoia, invoked allowed them to honor a typical Roman commander simply for his administrative competence, or even his position alone. In her view, these changes mark the introduction of honors for Roman commanders linked to the fact of their magistracy alone. However, as Anna Hilaire has demonstrated, the first century also saw a drastic shift away from the inscription of full decrees in favor of more condensed statue bases like these for local benefactors as well. Despite the limited number of full decrees for Romans in this period, I'd argue that such longer documents were almost certainly produced, even if they were no longer routinely inscribed. In form, then, this process echoes the spirit of the earlier dialogue between monarch and city. Critically, however, unlike their Hellenistic forebears or indeed their imperial successors, republican commanders directly competed with one another for prestige in the form of political success at Rome. A magistrate's reputation within his province could have a significant impact on his subsequent career. Without claiming that the threat of extortion charges successfully restrained rapacious governors, honorific decrees did promote a rapport between community and honorand, making later prosecution less likely. Furthermore, local honorific decrees could be adduced by a defendant as evidence that a prosecution was promoted by individual malcontents rather than the community writ large, as we see, for example, in Cicero's Pro Flaco, where he uses this tactic repeatedly to defend a former governor of Asia. Governors had a direct interest, therefore, in soliciting honors. In turn, pressure from magistrates, combined with the increasing personalization of influence through the spread of patronage, promoted innovation in the honorific system in Asia. Governors could pressure communities indirectly through their presence or their absence, or the responsiveness to petitions, or directly through the use and abuse of their power. However, crucial to generating this climate of innovation was competition between cities to establish and maintain meaningful relationships with governors. Levers available to poleis were limited to direct gifts, which were technically prohibited, which didn't stop too many people, or honorific acts. Given the logical proliferation of the latter, the question of how to approach governors posed itself to communities, and they responded with a variety of strategies. Now, the comparative blandness of the materials should not disguise the fact that individual communities did employ different strategies. Some took advantage of magistrates' family members as proxies to increase the visual and symbolic impact of their relationship with individuals. Pergamum, at least, had no qualms over erecting multiple statues to the same benefactor, and I found at least 5 examples where one individual has 2 or more statues dedicated to them in this period. While senior magistrates with imperium, that is governors, were more often the object of attested honorific acts, during the Republican period, quaestors, junior magistrates who assisted governors with financial issues, and legati, more senior advisors without official authority, but who could be delegated power by the governor, received their fair share of statues. Now this strengthens, though it does not prove, the argument that honours in this period were accorded out of more than simple expediency. I should note here also that even where the object of an honorific decree and statute passed for a Roman magistrate was to honour the individual, the public display in a civic context had a significant ongoing ideological impact on the inhabitants of the polis. It integrated members of the Roman elite, explicitly those involved in administration, within a local honorific discourse, and over time normalized the hierarchy between Roman officials and individual cities. Given that the surviving inscriptions should represent only a fraction of the original statue bases, the visual impact of these statues, especially in the major centers of Roman rule, should not be underestimated. While the specific places in which statues were located is often difficult or impossible to reconstruct, where such evidence does exist, it reinforces the idea that statues for Romans were placed in such locations. And I've given the example on this slide of the sanctuary of Apollo Clarios at Claros, and the sacred way towards it, which served as such an area for the nearby city of Colophon. And as you can see at the top here, we've got the edge of the temple. And then we have a series of statue bases, some for local honorans like Menippus, but then a series of Romans, proconsuls, various Valerii, and Lucius Lucullus here. Now, ideologically charged prominent locations such as agorae, marketplaces, and sacred routes would be dominated by such markers of beneficence, increasingly focused on Romans, as we can see here. These spaces were controlled by civic authorities, and while predominantly used on a quotidian basis by citizens, they were also intended for foreigners to see. In turn, this created a narrative of Roman benefaction towards the demos, mediated and controlled by the civic institutions of the community itself. Now, just to emphasize the visual impact here, I've included this picture of the southeastern corner of the Temple of Apollo Clarios and the reconstructed statue column for Menippus, a local benefactor. The full monument here includes not only an explanatory text akin to the short form inscriptions we've already seen for Romans, this little thing here, if you can see my mouse, hopefully you can, but also the full honorific decree for Menippus on the base of the column. Finally, the column itself would have been topped by a golden statue, which is no longer extant. Now, if we imagine the impact of a series of such columns as depicted in the earlier diagram here, all along the sacred way, we get some sense of the power of including such Roman figures in this local, monumental, honorific landscape. The corpus of identifiable honorific inscriptions relating to Roman officials and their immediate family members, originating from cities in Asia in the period of study, so 133 BCE to 14 CE, amounts to 130 texts, which I've found, relating to 64 individual officials, with an increasing number of inscriptions, though not honorans, under the Augustan regime. The data immediately reveals some broad trends. From 133 to the outbreak of civil war between Caesar and Pompey in 49, governors and their immediate family were the primary but not exclusive recipients of statues, who were named on 24 occasions. By contrast, legati received only 9 statues, of which 4 are directly related to military commanders granted imperium by their governors, and 16 statue bases survive for quaestors. Although 3 of these are for one man, Lucullus, who played a key role in mitigating the impact of Sulla's reorganization of the province in the 80s, and 9 more date to 5 years between 55 and 49. So this might be a more limited phenomenon than the evidence suggests. By contrast, though, during the Civil War period, which I've defined here as 49 to 30, when proconsular appointments broke down, only one governor received an honorific statues. The very popular Vata Azoricus, who received 5 extant statues, but still only 1 governor, while 16 different legati were recognized. Finally, under Augustus, the ratio of gubernatorial to other recipients increases substantially. We have 45 governors, only 1 potential legatus, and 5 honorific decrees for quaestors. Now, the increasingly circumscribed role for legati accompanying magistrates and provincial quaestors under the Augustan regime probably explain this evolution. There were far more limited opportunities to become an acting governor, for example, which reduced the chances available to become useful to poleis, which again feeds into this idea that these are for more than simply presence or the holding a magistracy. The overwhelming majority of these inscriptions originated with the demos, though there are a few examples that have come directly from the boule, and 5 examples that I found where it's a wider community that is dedicating these statues. But this re-emphasizes the extent to which civic assemblies retain control over the award and the dialogue around honor during the Roman period. While the issue of honorific decrees and the erection of statues for Roman officials remained an important phenomenon through the period, the language employed and inscribed underwent several noticeable changes. Prior to the invasion of Mithridates in 888, only 1 of 7 documents honoring one Marcus Popilius Linus on Kos used a traditional Hellenistic title, that of Euergetes, benefactor. Even here, however, this term was paired with the transliterated Latin term patron. Indeed, during the 90s BCE, a number of Greek cities chose to honor Roman magistrates with this Latin term. Claude Eilers plausibly supplies the epithet patron tas poleis, patron of the city, in another Coan statue base, honoring one Quintus Mucius Scaevola. An Ephesian statue base dedicated to Scaevola's wife, Caelia, or perhaps Caecilia, also names him patron, while the brothers Gaius and Lucius Valerius Flaccus were honored as such at Claros. The other 2 examples that we have from this period include no titles, simply honoring the recipients in traditional terms for their arete, their excellence, and their eunoia, goodwill. Now, despite the small sample size, the use of this term, rather than the existing repertoire of honorific language, does hold significance, as I've noted previously. Here, the language of patronage was co-opted into a new conceptual framework to construct a Roman-specific honorific relationship. The choice of poleis from the 90s onwards to use this novel technical term to honor magistrates represents a negotiated outcome arising from Roman social discourse in dialogue with local praxis. However, these early moves towards what looks like a standard system disappeared during the upheaval generated by Mithridates' invasion of Asia. After Sulla reorganized the provincial administration, most poleis were subjected to gubernatorial jurisdiction for the first time. However, their capacity to honor individuals through civic decrees remained untouched. As one of the few remaining levers to encourage favorable treatment, it is predictable that cities would continue to elevate commanders who had their own reasons to encourage the practice. One intriguing consequence of this change was the revival of traditional Hellenistic honorific language. Of 29 extant honorific inscriptions for Roman governors between the denouement of the First Mithridatic War and Augustus's consolidation of power, only 5 actually name these governors patron, 3 of which belong to one individual, Quintus Cicero, the brother of the famous Marcus Tullius Cicero. With the exception of a statue based for a shadowy Lucius Cornelius in Caria, each of these examples also combines this title with that of Euergetes, of benefactor. Now, honors for legati and quaestores during this period show a similar pattern, although they do have a greater number of patrons. Indeed, the numbers are close to identical. For each group, we have 13 inscriptions out of a total of 15 for legati and 16 for quaestors, which honored their recipients as iuergates, 10 as patron, and 4 as soter, as savior. Now, given that these officials had less scope to materially benefit cities, more substantial links on the ground seem to have been expected. Although, again, I note here that in the quaestorian case, of the 10 patrons that we find, 4 of them, again, belong to the same individual, one Lucius Antonius, the brother of Marcus. So again, we must be cautious with these numbers and what survived. Now, these Hellenistic titles had diverse origins and implications, offering cities the opportunity to differentiate more overtly between their recipients. The generic iuergates, benefactor, originally implied admission to a category of non-citizens with privileged status in the poleis. Nevertheless, it was consistently employed as an honorific title from at least the 5th century BCE onwards. By contrast, soter was originally applied only to divine figures, and ktistes to semi-divine or legendary founders of cities. Both, however, did come to be applied to Hellenistic rulers in an honorific capacity. Dylan Bloy has suggested that this titulature allowed poleis to better articulate their relationship with Roman magistrates, expressing for him a connection only in terms of benefaction, became inappropriate when the power asymmetries between magistrate and poleis became clear. This model certainly has some heuristic value. The sudden deterioration of civic status in the post-Sullan era radically altered this balance of power between magistrate and civic community. As most cities were now directly subject to gubernatorial jurisdiction, the impact of each office holder on civic affairs became amplified. Given this increasing significance, titles previously employed for Hellenistic rulers became appropriate for individual Romans who had contributed to the community's well-being in a tangible way. Now, the growing emphasis on Augustus and the members of the imperial family in the honorific landscape is an important marker of the shift from an outwardly republican mode of government to an overtly imperial one. Sadly, I don't really have time to go into that. However, as is pertinent, more broadly under Augustus, the political revolution at the imperial center and the consequent changes to provincial administration did have this significant impact. After Actium, only 5 officials below the level of governor were honored, as I already mentioned. By contrast, we have 45 inscriptions for proconsular magistrates, 30 of which produce 1 or more titles. Only 4 of these do not name their honorand iuergates, which implies a certain amount of standardization of honorific language used. Indeed, only 6 record the title soter, 3 of which honor Sextus Apuleius, who was the nephew of Augustus during his proconsulship. Now, despite the well-worn narrative of decline of its civic patronage under the Principate, we do have 11 individual governors in 14 inscriptions who are entitled patron, suggesting an enduring honorific value during the reign of Augustus. This forms a strong contrast with the intermediate period, where legati and quaestors were regularly attested as patrons, and governors tended not to appear. In turn, we might infer that gubernatorial patronage actually reasserted its symbolic importance under the early Augustan regime, in the absence of lower-ranked officials with political weight at Rome, before declining slowly as the institution's utility waned. Moreover, based on the absence of Hellenistic titles outside of iuergates, the concern of Augustus with preserving his unique authority may offer another explanation. As John Nichols highlights, soter and ktistes had their roots in royal titulature and could be held to challenge the position of the new ruler. Overall, under Augustus, the relative number of surviving inscriptions does actually slightly increase, but the number of individuals receiving honors radically shrinks, which may suit a narrative of routine two-year commands, giving governors greater opportunity to make an impact on individual cities, or a regularization of judicial assize districts, which would make the governors more visible on a province-wide basis. Now, beyond these broad trends, the corpus does point to a vibrant ecosystem of differing epigraphic cultures and experimentation in forms of honorific practice between cities. For example, the number of extant honorific inscriptions for Romans at Ephesus sharply increased during the Augustan period and continued to grow during the Principate. By contrast, elsewhere in Asia, the long-term trend from the Republican period onwards is one of decline. However, the earliest dedication to a Roman official by the Ephesian demos dates to the mid-1st century CE. 4 earlier examples, referring to Roman officials from Augustus onward, all originate with private individuals, even if, in one case, they do identify themselves as a civic patronage. The comparative wealth of evidence for Ephesus renders it implausible, in my view, that this dearth of honors for governors was simply a product of the evidence profile. More likely, this phenomenon was a distinctively Ephesian response to the circumstances of its tense relationship with the Roman state after the First Mithridatic War. Delos, the island of Delos, also had a distinctive local practice. Though not administered by the Roman commander in Asia, it did lay on the most convenient route to the province and provides 17 inscriptions referring to officials who are active in Asia. However, we only have only two of these 17 originated with the civic body, and both of these are dated to the 90s, both naming their honorands as patron. Now, similarly, the demos at Sardis seems to have avoided public honors for Roman officials. But by contrast, Caunus shows a remarkable consistency. Across 11 inscriptions for various officials, every honorand was titled Euergetes, and 4 of them were named as patrons. While broad trends are detectable across the period within the province as a whole, diverse practices between civic communities remain a crucial element of this burgeoning provincial culture. Honors granted to family members of Roman magistrates make up nearly a quarter of the total dossier, 35 out of 130 by my count, underscoring their importance as a conduit for poleis to exploit. However, the difference in practice between communities is striking. Magnesia on the Meander honored family members alongside all 3 governors that it honored, while relatives were also associated with several Republican commanders memorialized at Caunus, Kos, Pergamum, and Samos. Outside of these communities, however, this phenomenon was much more limited. Now, I've given 2 examples on the slide here, one honoring Kylia, which I've already mentioned, or Caecilia, the wife of Scaevola at Ephesus, and one honoring Polla Terrentia, the mother of one Aulus Terentius Varro. Now, although the prevailing view holds that female family members did not accompany their male relatives to the province, I would prefer to be more cautious. One would expect that the statue atop a statue base was of the honorand rather than the magistrate and relates to their own worthiness. Now, comparative evidence for local female benefactors, such as Archippe Cumae famously, suggests that women in late Hellenistic Asia could have meaningful agency. As such, it is at least possible that these family members were honored for actions in their own right, particularly since we have contemporary evidence of women accompanying their husbands throughout Italy. Now, whether this was, if they were male, as empowered officials, or whether in both cases for their influence with the governor in private or in concilium, it's unclear. But in any case, communities could expand the opportunities available to them through using family members by providing a means to increase the visual and spatial impact of honors for one governor without having multiple statues of the same individual. Several innovations in titulature also appear in the 1st century more broadly. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, for example, was honored widely as Tris Autocrator, Imperator for the 3rd time. Though this titulature was unique to Pompeius itself and was perfectly accurate, it's often used to supplant traditional references to a magistracy, such as proconsul, and evoked a sense of distance between this commander and his rivals. Though the use of autocrator and its transliteration imperator as titles for Roman magistrates is not unparalleled, elsewhere it does occur in ambiguous contexts. Pompeius is also attested as the patron of the Koinon of the Ionians, a collective of 13 cities in Ionia, which had already previously honored Attalid monarchs. Now, to act as patron for most of the major cities in one of the most urbanized areas of the province was unprecedented. Admittedly, that does describe most of Pompeius's career, in which he conquered swathes of Asia Minor and the Levant. And it can also be seen in the epithet granted in the same inscription of Epoptes ges tekai thalases, he who watches over land and sea. Now, this was very much a divine epithet, most closely associated with Zeus. But these collective honors were not reserved for exceptional commanders. Shortly afterwards, the Colophonian demos honored Quintus Cicero, brother of Marcus, as the benefactor of the Greeks and the patron of the demos. This description as euergetes ton Hellenon is given greater prominence by the disappointment voiced by Marcus in a letter to Quintus in 59 over his failure to gratify important Romans in the province sufficiently. Now, the extension of honor beyond the civic body into the broader realm of the Greeks, doubtless of Asia, speaks to a growing sense of community between cities in this period. Similarly, in 39, we see Marcus Cocceius Nerva honored as such at Teos, as the common benefactor and the savior of the province, as well as patron of the city. Now, this again does preserve a contrast between the position of Nerva vis-a-vis the province and vis-a-vis Teos specifically, which, there's probably something to that. We can talk about that in the comments. Though the context was significantly different, Cicero governed the province for 3 peaceful years, albeit during a growing fiscal crisis, while Nerva as legate played a key role in forcing the invading Parthians out of Asia in 40 and 39. This does imply that cities were happy to present both men as serving a community that extended beyond their own civic borders. Now, this could speak to the influence of the emergent Koinon of Asia, the community of Asian cities during this period, as the province itself does begin to honor governors during the Augustan period as this body becomes more institutionalized. Finally, there are a fascinating small group of texts erected outside of the honoring community. Now, the earliest example of these is a decree of Pisidian Prostana for the Quaestor pro praetore Marcus Antonius, the grandfather, I think, of the famous Mark Antony, at Delos in 113. Though this produces the standard honorific formula, it reveals a significant expense on the part of a remote Pisidian community to honor a lowly magistrate, albeit with delegated imperium. It raises interesting, though sadly unanswerable questions about whether or how Antonius intervened in this region. Similarly, an inscription erected by the group of cities, the Mysian Abaetai, before the Temple of Diana at Lake Nemi near Rome, honors Quintus Salubius Naso, a legate of Lucullus, for defending them during the Third Mithridatic War. This text is bilingual, Latin followed by Greek, and speaks to the increasing engagement between Asia and Italy during this period. The Mysian Abaetai are rarely attested as acting as a community, however, and their choice to make a collective dedication abroad rather than in their own territory does raise questions of agency. Again, the evidence is insufficient to draw firm conclusions, but the strong Latin connection and the prominence of this shrine may indicate a strategic attempt on Saluvius's part to increase his own standing within the Roman elite. We have two further examples of a statue based for Quintus Mucius Scaevola, again at Olympia, apparently offered by the peoples and tribes in Asia, the forerunner to the koinon, and for Publius Numicius Pica, in the Augustan period, on behalf of Provincia Asia at Rome. In each of the above examples, the choice of location does appear to be significant. The sanctuary of Apollo on Delos held global center of power. In the
Okay, I think that we lost our speaker. I hope that he's going to be able to reconnect pretty soon. I hope it has nothing to do with the thunderstorm that is starting to be really threatening here in Ankara. Okay, I'm trying to connect to find out whether Brad is able to reconnect. It looks as if he's trying to. So a little bit of patience, please. I think that he was coming to his conclusion anyway, so, but nevertheless, it would be nice to hear all of the lecture. Meanwhile, maybe I can ask you already to write your questions in the Q&A so that afterwards we can continue with the question and answer session. Brad, are you back? Haha, very good.
Apologize.
No, it's not.
I was thinking that is one way to avoid questions.
Yeah.
So
right.
if you just bear with me 1 second, I'll try and bring my PowerPoint up. I'm not quite sure where I cut out, if that's all right, but we will see. Okay. Do you recall what where I got into?
I think you were talking about Mucius Scaevola.
Scaevola. Okay, cool, easy. Okay, so yeah, so a statue. We have two further examples beyond those for Marcus Antonius, and Saluvius. One for Quintus Mucius Scaevola at Olympia, apparently offered by the peoples and tribes in Asia, a forerunner to the koinon, and an Augustan inscription at Rome for one Publius Numicius Pica, apparently on behalf of the whole province. Now, in each of the examples that are given, the choice of location appears to be significant. The sanctuary of Apollo on Delos held global significance in the Hellenistic world, and the island had a growing community of Roman inhabitants from the mid-2nd century onwards. While Olympia boasted the pan-Hellenic sanctuary at Zeus, the Temple of Diana at Nemi held great importance for the Latin community, and Rome clearly was the center of power. Now, in the latter three instances, these decrees emerge from a collective entity, which could indicate that the site of the inscription or statue was subject to negotiation between the various members of that collective. These four statues match a pattern of dedication in Asia, but suggest a deliberate concern with visibility beyond the confines of the honoring community. That is, they were in some sense outward-facing documents. Irrespective of whether the recipient solicited the grant or influenced the location, these groups chose to advertise their relationship with individual Romans in well-trafficked and highly meaningful international locations. Consequently, we should view the small group of inscriptions as attempts by the dedicants to articulate publicly their relationship with Rome and its representatives. Outward-facing and innovative honorific grants highlight the strategic exploration of new ground by communities. Both represent attempts to engage effectively with the imperial power to the benefit of the dedicants themselves, and they illustrate the extent to which such experimentation was possible within the parameters of the traditional reciprocal honorific dialogue. Now, to wrap up, if this works. Yes, there we go. So I've argued here that civic honorific decrees and resultant public statutes remained critically important in constructing the relationship between civic communities in Asia and the Roman authorities throughout the first century of Roman hegemony. That these honorific practices evolved as Rome came to dominate the region is unsurprising. The absence of a single focal point for honorific action undermined existing models of benefaction and legitimacy. Moreover, the Roman state placed a far greater emphasis on fides, on loyalty, than the reciprocity underlying earlier models used by the Hellenistic monarchs. However, civic honorific decrees continue to play a vital role in mediating exchanges between Greek poleis and their hegemon, if indirectly. Individual Roman magistrates and their close relatives received statues regularly from cities in this period. The statues and their accompanying decrees were undoubtedly aimed in part at their honorands. While resembling the formula of earlier exchanges, the framework underpinning the dialogue had fundamentally changed. As Oppius carefully noted in his response to the Aphrodisias, no magistrate could credibly guarantee the ongoing exchange of personal benefaction for honor. Instead, communities had to adapt to the new language and reality of Roman power, which they did by employing a range of strategies. An early trend towards an integrated honorific practice revolving around Roman patronage structures lost momentum after the First Mithridatic War. Instead, communities largely returned to Hellenistic titles, both civic-focused like euagates, and those previously reserved for royals, such as soter or testas. The change in power dynamics and the more overt nature of Roman state power after Sulla's reorganization of Asia partially explains this choice. However, the reality of competition between Roman actors also encouraged this experimentation and the inflation of honors, which flowed through into honors for local benefactors, which I haven't had time to discuss, but famously Diodorus Pasparus at Pergamum or Theophanes of Mytilene, whose honors are much more inflated than we'd normally expect. The employment of family members as proxies begins early, but seems centered on relatively few poleis. Similarly, the repeated honoring of a single magistrate seems to be a restrictive phenomenon. Overall, civic honorific decrees in this period are striking in their diversity, though there are some broad trends detectable. As the Roman state and its institutions evolved through the triumvirate and especially under the Principate, our data implies the number of honors directed to magistrates below the rank of governor radically decreased. This, I would argue, resulted from local choices in response to the rapid and extensive institutional changes within the state itself, seeking to maintain an ongoing dialogue of relevance. I've highlighted the importance of changes in language and titulature over the course of the period of study, but statute bases also imply statues, and the location, arrangement, and sheer physicality of these statues ensured the real, tangible influence of honorific practice on the topography and ideological framing of civic life in the province. The integration of Romans into the local honorific landscape in growing numbers and the visual impact of monumental statues, columns, and decrees in prominent ideologically charged locations helped to emphasize the legitimacy of Roman rule and instantiate its reality. Now, what I've hoped to show here is that civic honorific decrees continue to play a critical role in framing this relationship. However, agency lay primarily with local rather than imperial authorities. The inscription of honorific decrees and construction of statues established a narrative of the community's interaction with Rome for the benefit primarily of its own inhabitants. And in doing so, it came to define local views of and engagement with Roman Empire in Asia. Thank you very much for your attention. So I will also stop sharing. Or should I? Lut?
Yeah, I think it would be better if we could. I mean, I think it would be good if you would stop sharing, and then if people want you to go back to specific slides, we can do that. So thank you very much. I see that there are questions already in the Q&A. So let's start with the question of Anthony Shepard, who asks, as you say, there was a transactional element between cities and Roman officials. But were these increasingly numerous honorific decrees also a kind of game, substituting for the substantive business of a free city?
No, thank you very much, Anthony, for your question. Yes, to an extent. Yes, to an extent, it is kind of a game. And obviously, this isn't the only game in town, as it were. Obviously, alongside the passage of these decrees, you have traditional forms of diplomacy. This is exactly the period where we have, we have at Rome lots of evidence for a procession of embassies asking for privileges, but also acting as witnesses in various extortion trials. We have multiple examples, but one that comes to mind is one of Marcus Cicero's letters to Quintus. He gives a list of all of the embassies and ambassadors and representatives of cities that have come to see him in Rome to complain about Quintus's behavior. And there are 4 or 5 of these at these embassies that he's talked down, essentially. So yes, to answer your question, yeah, there is definitely a transactional element to this, but it is also part of a larger framework of negotiation that's going on in between cities, individual cities, and individual Romans and the state more broadly.
Okay, Petya Andreeva says, thank you for the interesting talk. I have 2 questions about the evidence of privileges bestowed in the cities of the province of Asia. Is there a certain pattern or some differences in granting of certain kinds of privileges during the late Republic compared to the early Principate? Mm-hmm. Was the display of official honorary decrees in the urban public spaces, did it depend on the direction of urban development in the province of Asia, or was it the other way around?
No, thank you very much, Petra. They're both really interesting questions. I'll start with the second one because that's easier to answer. As I mentioned in passing, often the particular archaeological context of these finds doesn't allow us to reconstruct in any detail exactly how they were laid out. Examples like Kleros are very difficult to find. But for the most part, the evidence does seem to suggest that the display of these statues reflected existing practices in a given community rather than driving new innovations of display. Now, obviously, this changes over time, but as we see at Kleros, we already have earlier inscriptions for local honorands, and this is extended out to later Roman officials. So that's that side. And I guess you would expect this. Local practices of honoring individuals, whether they are kings, whether they are local benefactors, are presumably structured in a particular way because that is what the community has decided is appropriate. When you then switch that to a new honorand, a new type of honorand, whether he's external, you're going to follow the same principles, at least at the outset. And so, yeah, it's the local practices drive the way in which Romans are honored in individual locations, is my view. Now, the second thing, the first question, is there a pattern or difference in the granting of certain kind of privileges during the late Republic, and is there a difference? There is an extremely interesting inscription of a letter from Augustus to, I believe it is Samos, in the, I think there's some consternation about the date, but I think it's sort of late 20s BC or mid 20s BC, in which Augustus refuses to grant freedom to Samos, despite his wife's advice and work on behalf of the Samians, because he doesn't think it is appropriate because they haven't performed anything exceptional. And then he uses the example of Aphrodisias, with which he has a very close relationship over a number of years, as a counterexample. And of course, the letter we find at Aphrodisias because they have an interest in showing how special their relationship is. Now, within a few years, they were granted freedom, but it does show that there is this transition, or it does suggest that there is this transition from the idea that you grant privileges in the late Republic for loyalty to Rome to a more transactional relationship between the monarch and the city or island, which does superficially come to resemble under the empire the practices that predate the Republic, which obviously is extremely interesting. But yeah, I hope that answers your question.
So in the imperial period, do magistrates still receive honorific decrees, or is it only the emperors?
So they drop off quite from memory, and this is beyond the end of my period.
I know, but nevertheless.
From memory, they do, for governors, do tend to become less frequent. Obviously, the number of honorific decrees for emperors greatly expands. But again, those for quaestors and those for legates just completely disappear. And this makes a certain amount of sense because they're not able to actually have a meaningful transactional relationship with cities. And cities do very quickly adjust to this idea that there is one man that you go to, and he is the man that can reward you, and sort of cut out the governors where they can.
Indeed, makes sense. I have another question, if all right, and that's about the location of these honorific statues. And because you say that, you said rightly so, that only a fraction of the original amount of statues is preserved, first of all. But my question is, like, for example, the sanctuary in Claros. So if there were so many of them, I understand that, I mean, having these Roman magistrates as part of all these statues in, for example, Claros, makes it very significant that they are honored there. But if there were so many of them, would that not reduce the power of the individual honorific monument, first of all, and also of the honor that was bestowed on the honorific, of the individuals who received those honors?
Yes, no, thank you very much. That is a very important point. And obviously, I didn't have time to go into anything outside of the realm of necessarily the decrees themselves. But I think I mentioned in passing the fact that there is this massive inflation of the actual honors that are decreed for individuals in precisely this period. So to take the example of Diodorus Pasparus at Pergamum, for example, who's a local benefactor, but we have the full decree, essentially, so it's easier to see what has actually been decreed. He's not given one statue, he's given 3 statues, one of which is golden, one is silver, one is bronze. He's given the right to enter the theatre, whenever he enters the theatre, he's announced special seating. There are a plethora of things. Plethora of things for him. You have Monogenes of Sardis, I think, is another one. Is another example from slightly later again, and he is again multiple statues in multiple cities, and we can see similar. The evidence is less clear, but we can see similar things going on with Roman honorans as well. You have this problem of, okay, well, if everyone gets a statue, how do we make this person feel more special? And so it just inflates and inflates and inflates and goes back to being almost parallel, and in some cases exceeding what were honors that were granted to kings, for example. This is the context that you get divine honors for certain Romans and certain locals appearing in the 1st century, which of course the rise of Augustus then sort of tamps down slightly later on, not slightly, tamps down completely later on. It is an important point that as more governors are honored, the impact of an individual statue is going to be reduced. But then there is also the point that, to feed back into my broader point here, that when you go from having one statue of a Roman in a civic agora to having 10 statues, it really does reinforce the extent to which they've been integrated into a hierarchy within the sort of collective memory, collective ideology of that city. Okay, thank you very much. If there are no more questions, and it looks as if that is the case, unless, Daniel, there are some that were posted on YouTube, then I'm going to say thank you very much for this very interesting lecture. It's great to see that your research is going well here at the BIAA. And I would like to ask all the attendees to keep an eye on all the forthcoming lectures, because we have a pretty full program for the next couple of months. It's a wide variety of topics. So I do think that that we will be able to offer
something for everybody to be of interest to every one of you. So thank you very much. Have a lovely evening. Thank you once again, Brad, and hope to see you again in one of the forthcoming lectures soon. Bye-bye. Have a nice evening or day, depending on where you are. Bye-bye.